New York, 1955. Taxi horns bounced between the buildings while steam hissed out of the sidewalks like the city was exhaling. Newspaper boys shouted about Eisenhower, Sinatra, and the Brooklyn Dodgers. Neon signs buzzed overhead. Everything looked loud, alive, and modern. But underneath all that noise and brightness was something older, something hidden. An empire, not steel, not banking, not skyscrapers. Olive oil. To most New Yorkers, olive oil was just another item in the kitchen, a dusty glass bottle sitting next to the stove. Grandmothers poured it over pasta. Delis stacked imported crates from Italy. Restaurants went through it by the gallon. But here's what absolutely nobody knew. Every drop, every barrel, every shipment that came into the city belonged to the Mafia. Not partially, not sometimes, completely. A monopoly so perfect, real companies could only dream of it. A multi-million-dollar shadow industry hiding in plain sight. To understand why the mob cared about olive oil, you have to understand the mob. They didn't survive off gambling tables and shakedowns alone. They survived by blending crime with business, normal-looking businesses that made their real money possible. Trash, construction, produce, garment trucking, meat distribution. And then there was olive oil, the crown jewel. Why? Because it hit every requirement the Mafia loved. It was imported. Imports came through the docks, and the docks belonged to the mob. It was heavy, messy, and hard to inspect. Perfect for hiding things like heroin. Restaurant buyers were loyal. Chefs bought from the same distributor for decades. The profit margin was enormous, especially when the oil was diluted or outright fake. It was Italian, which made mob involvement seem natural. It created leverage. A restaurant that buys your oil is a restaurant that owes you. And a restaurant that owes you is quiet, the perfect place to stash cash, share secrets, or plan the next move. Pier 47, Manhattan. 2 a.m. A Sicilian cargo ship slipped through the fog like a ghost. Longshoremen, all union men from Local 1814, were waiting. And Local 1814 answered directly to Albert Anastasia. A Mad Hatter, a boss of Murder, Inc., a man who once bragged, "The law can't touch you when you control the docks." And he wasn't wrong. Every barrel of olive oil that came off those ships was already mob property. The cargo went onto trucks owned by fake companies, driven to Brooklyn warehouses guarded by mob soldiers. Paperwork changed hands. Invoices got rewritten. Signatures appeared magically. By sunrise, the shipment was legitimate. It wasn't just oil anymore. It was power. Long before anyone else caught on, the Genovese family realized olive oil could be the perfect front. Vito Genovese, cold, calculating, and infinitely patient, began buying importing companies in the 1930s. Vesuvio importing Roman Empire foods Napoli. Produce Atlantic Mediterranean traders all looked above board, all paid taxes, all hired staff, and all quietly moved fake invoices, hidden shipments, and delivery routes designed for much more than food. Sometimes the trucks carried heroin, sometimes counterfeit money, sometimes envelopes stuffed with payments, but they always carried loyalty. After Anastasia was famously murdered in a barbershop in 1957, control of the docks fell to a very different kind of leader, Carlo Gambino. Where Genovese ruled by fear, Gambino ruled with quiet precision. He never shouted. He never bragged. He simply bought influence, union bosses, customs officers, inspectors, warehouse owners. Gambino understood a crucial truth. Violence wins fights. Logistics wins empires. Under him, olive oil imports exploded, doubling, tripling, even quadrupling. Millions of gallons poured in, some real, many fake, all profitable. And every gallon paid tribute to the families. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Between the 1940s and the 1980s, most of the olive oil sold in New York wasn't olive oil, especially not the fancy, extra virgin kind. The mob perfected an incredibly simple scheme. Mix real olive oil with cheap oils, cottonseed, soybean, hazelnut, sunflower. Blend it and heat it. Add chlorophyll for color. Add beta-carotene for flavor. Print a fake Italian label. Cost to produce, roughly $3 wholesale price, around $18. The scam was so huge that even legitimate food companies started buying mob oil. It was cheaper, always available, and no one asked questions. By the 1960s, if your relatives in Brooklyn had olive oil in the kitchen, it came from the mob. The mob's pitch always started politely. Buy from us, great price, great quality. If you accepted, smooth sailing. If you declined, the problems began. A missing delivery, a cracked crate, a sudden rodent issue, a health inspector who showed up too often, a brick through a window. By the third warning, restaurants gave in. By the fifth, they practically smiled while saying yes. The mob didn't want to destroy businesses. They wanted to own them. And olive oil was the leash. Olive oil wasn't just about money. It was about smuggling. Heroin traveled from Turkey and Lebanon to Sicily, and from Sicily to New York. Most people knew this pipeline as the French Connection, but the Sicilians had their own system. And what did they use to move heroin into the U.S.? Olive oil drums, sealed, labeled as food, cleared by bribed customs officials. Nobody opened them. Nobody questioned them. Shipments grew every year, and inspectors grew more relaxed. By the 1970s, the mob wasn't just feeding the city. They were supplying its addictions, all hidden behind the kitchen staple. For once, the five families reached a peaceful agreement. Olive oil was too profitable to fight over. They carved up the olive oil empire the way kings divide a conquered kingdom. The Genoveses controlled the importation, every ship, every manifest, every crate leaving Palermo or Naples. The Gambinos owned the docks. Nothing touched New York Harbor without their blessing. The Lucchese's ran the trucking, the roads, the drivers, the routes, the deliveries. The Bonanos oversaw the bottling and labeling, turning raw shipments into legitimate Italian brands. And the Colombos? They handled restaurant distribution and the enforcement that kept everyone honest. One of the most efficient criminal monopolies in American history. No rivals, no regulation, nothing but pure profit. From the 1930s to the 1980s, the Mafia controlled 80% of New York's olive oil imports 95% of the oil used in Italian restaurants. Virtually 100% of Little Italy's food supply, warehouses, trucks, customers, thousands of them. Millions of bottles. No protests, no headlines, no big investigations. The scam was too smooth, too quiet, too convenient. The mob got rich. Restaurants got cheap product. Consumers got olive oil, even when it wasn't olive oil at all. For decades, everyone believed the heroin entering the United States flowed through France. Newspapers printed breathless stories about chemists in Marseille and Corsican smugglers darting through the shadows. Hollywood turned it into a genre, gritty detectives chasing mysterious European drug rings. But the truth, the version whispered only behind closed doors inside FBI offices, was much darker. The olive oil trade wasn't a cover. It was the pipeline. A pipeline so flawless, so unassuming, and so perfectly disguised that by the time the government figured out what was happening, the damage had already reshaped American history. Here's how the machine worked. Heroin began in the poppy fields of Turkey. From there, it passed into Lebanon, and eventually Sicily, where families like the Grecos, the Bontates, and the Inzerillos refined it into a powder so pure it could ruin a city with a single shipment. And how did it cross the ocean? Not hidden in suitcases. Not carried by jittery couriers. Not slipped through the mail. It entered America through the front door, inside sealed olive oil drums with official customs stickers and flawless paperwork. A food import. Nothing suspicious. Nothing worth inspecting. The perfect Trojan horse. The Sicilian Mafia and the American Mafia were never separate worlds. They were the same organism. One bloodstream stretched across the Atlantic. They shared family ties, secrets, enemies, and above all, money. In the 1950s and 60s, olive oil shipments leaving Palermo were worth more than gold. Every drum carried 40 gallons of actual oil, and beneath a hidden false bottom, 5 to 10 kilograms of heroin. A single cargo ship carried thousands of drums. Even if a tiny fraction contained drugs, it would flood New York streets. But the mob's error rate wasn't 2%. It was less than 1. Why? Because nobody inspected food shipments. Especially not Italian ones. Especially not olive oil. And certainly not crates unloaded at docks, controlled by the Genovese and Gambino families. It was the perfect partnership, a billion-dollar marriage between Sicily and New York. But no empire survives without protection. On the waterfront, that protection came from the International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA. At a glance, longshoremen looked like regular working men. Heavy hands, coffee and donuts during breaks, cigarettes tucked behind their ears, voices rough from cold mornings by the harbor. But the leadership? That was a fortress. The ILA wasn't just a union. It was a shield, a political tool, an invisible army. And every foreman and steward along the docks answered to the mob. If a barrel needed to vanish, it disappeared. If a document had to be lost, it evaporated. If an inspector got too curious, he was reassigned before he could ask the second question. Cooperation wasn't about fear. It was about survival. Those who resisted lost their jobs, their pensions, or something far worse. Those who complied got Christmas envelopes stuffed with cash, quiet bonuses, and protection from layoffs. And that machine kept the heroin pipeline hidden for nearly 30 years. Once the barrels cleared the docks, they were shipped to warehouse districts across the city. Red Hook, Brooklyn, Maspeth and Long Island City in Queens, Hunts Point in the Bronx, the meatpacking district in Manhattan. Inside those anonymous brick buildings, behind bent metal gates and dusty loading docks, mob ran one of the most profitable operations in U.S. history. Late at night, trusted crews pried open the false bottoms. Out came the bricks of heroin wrapped in wax paper. The olive oil was drained into clean containers and later bottled under authentic Mediterranean labels. Then everything was divided. The oil went to restaurants. The heroin went to dealers. The money went to bosses who never touched a single product. But massive profits create something dangerous. Greed. Not from the government. From each other. The olive oil racket was so lucrative that the 5 families began stepping over each other as boundaries. The system was supposed to be organized. The Lucchese's handled trucking. The Gambinos controlled the docks. The Genoveses oversaw importation. The Bonanos dealt with bottling and labeling. The Colombos placed the product in restaurants. But greed doesn't respect maps. Drivers were beaten. Warehouses were torched. Crates vanished. Invoices were forged. Territories blurred. The Commission, the mob's ruling council, had to step in repeatedly to prevent an all-out war. Because if a war started, law enforcement would start paying attention. And if law enforcement paid attention, they'd discover olive oil wasn't just olive oil. It was drugs, money, influence, power. A second prohibition hiding in plain sight. By the 1960s, mob-controlled olive oil brands flooded grocery shelves. Roma Gold, Mediterraneo Supreme, Bella Sicilia, Capo d'Oro, La Stella Blue. They looked convincingly Italian. Elegant fonts, Tuscan artwork, gold crests, fake import seals. Some of these brands didn't even exist in Italy. They were invented in Brooklyn basements, labels printed in Queens, glass bottles manufactured in New Jersey. You could walk into a supermarket in Manhattan and buy authentic Italian olive oil that had never been anywhere near the Mediterranean, and nobody questioned it. The taste seemed fine. The price was good. Restaurants loved the steady supply. And the Mafia kept the entire system running like a Swiss watch. For years, the racket operated silently. No headlines. No shootouts, just money. Then came a new threat. Independent importers. A younger generation of honest Italian-American businessmen tried to bring in real olive oil at competitive prices. They ignored mob pressure. They refused tribute. They built legitimate networks. At first, the mob tried charm. Let's work together. Then pressure. You should buy from us. Then threats. You're making this hard? And when none of that worked, violence, storefronts burned, warehouses exploded, trucks vanished, competitors disappeared. One importer, Pietro Rossi, refused to pay for protection. He was found beaten near his overturned truck in Queens. When detectives asked what happened, he whispered the only answer that kept him alive. I fell. That was the power of the mob. Not fear, but obedience. By 1968, the olive oil empire had grown too large to hide. A young FBI agent named James Kearney noticed strange patterns. Restaurants with different suppliers receiving oil from the same source. Truckers from independent companies cashing checks at the same social clubs. Warehouse foremen tied to the same charitable organizations. Olive oil imports rising while Mediterranean harvests stayed flat. Something didn't match. Kearney filed reports. They moved up the ladder. But the moment an investigation started, evidence vanished. Witnesses fell silent. Agents were transferred. Informants backed out. The mob had eyes everywhere. The first break came in 1971. Customs inspectors in Newark tapped a barrel of olive oil and heard something strange. Inside, they found oil, a false bottom, and 7 kilograms of heroin. It was the first crack in the wall. Even then, investigators believed it was a small ring. They had no idea the entire supply chain, from Sicily to New York diners, was corrupted. They had no idea they were up against the most sophisticated criminal distribution network in American history. The 5 families saw the seizure as a warning, but instead of pulling back, they doubled down. The money was too big to walk away from. By the early 1970s, 3 storms were forming. New federal wiretap laws, giving the FBI surveillance powers it had never possessed. The rising Pizza Connection investigations, tracing suspicious shipments to Italian-run pizzerias. Internal mob wars, breaking the unity that had protected the olive oil racket for decades. For the first time, the empire trembled. And when empires tremble, cracks widen. Cracks the FBI was waiting to exploit. Cracks that would reveal decades of silent domination. Cracks that would eventually collapse the monopoly. But only after one final, desperate push by the families to squeeze every last dollar before it all came crashing down. By the late 1970s, the Mafia's olive oil monopoly, once invisible, elegant, and seemingly untouchable, started to shake. Not because the mob got careless, not because the government suddenly became brilliant. It cracked because the world changed, and the roots that once moved olive oil began moving something else. The families didn't see it coming. They were too busy expanding, stacking cash, and repeating their favorite lie. We can't be touched. They never stopped to consider that the very things that made olive oil the perfect cover global shipping lanes, anonymous cargo, flexible paperwork, corruptible ports, could just as easily destroy them, because another business was growing, more addictive, more profitable, and hungry for the exact same infrastructure, heroin. Once heroin fully slipped into the olive oil supply lines, the Mafia lost control of the very empire it had built. From olive oil to pizza, to understand how the olive oil racket collapsed, you have to understand the operation that replaced it. It began quietly. A handful of Sicilian clans, driven out of their homeland by internal wars, landed in America with very little no money. No businesses, just connections, grudges, and experience smuggling contraband. They looked at the olive oil network, the trucks, the warehouses, the distributors, the import companies, and asked a simple question. If olive oil can move without being noticed, why not heroin? Out of that thought came the Pizza Connection, the largest narcotics pipeline in American history. $1 billion heroin empire hiding behind small pizzerias, family restaurants, bakeries, imported food businesses, and at the top sat many of the same Sicilian clans that had once controlled olive oil. The shift was almost effortless. Where a barrel of olive oil once sat in a warehouse in Brooklyn or Newark, now stood a container packed with pure no-4 white heroin, wrapped in wax paper and buried inside shipments of tomato cans, oil tins, or espresso machines. The system was the same. Only the cargo changed, and the bosses were convinced they were untouchable. They still owned the ports. They still owned the truckers. They still owned the warehouses. They still owned the paperwork. Who would bother to inspect a shipment of olive oil from Palermo? Nobody. Until someone finally did. The weak link, the empire didn't fall because the FBI suddenly became a genius organization. It fell because the Mafia did what it always eventually does. It trusted the wrong people. In 1981, a mid-level Sicilian trafficker named Tommaso Buscetta was arrested in Brazil. Facing extradition back to Sicily, where rival clans were murdering old allies by the dozen, he realized going home meant going into a grave. So he broke one of the oldest rules of Cosa Nostra. He talked. Buscetta told investigators something they'd never properly understood. Follow the olive oil. Where the olive oil goes, the heroin goes. He laid out the system. 55-gallon drums with a thin layer of real oil. Vacuum-sealed bags of heroin hanging inside crates with false bottoms, forged customs paperwork, pizza shops used as retail drug hubs. Buscetta's testimony was the first serious crack. But the real quake came from someone even more unexpected. A tired truck driver from New Jersey. He wasn't a made man. He wasn't Sicilian. He wasn't even a career criminal. He was just exhausted by threats, by low pay, by lost containers, by mysterious cargo he was told not to ask about. When he finally spoke to federal agents, he said, "Olive oil, that's the code. Nobody's really moving olive oil anymore. It's all powder." That statement blew the doors open. What followed was the full exposure of the Pizza Connection, an operation so huge it made Prohibition-era bootlegging look like petty smuggling. The crackdown that followed became the largest coordinated anti-mafia effort modern law enforcement had ever attempted. The FBI teamed up with Italian Carabinieri, French narcotics squads, Swiss banking regulators, German customs officials, Canadian border services, the U.S. Customs Service, Interpol D-units around the world. The Mafia had faced cops before. It had never faced a worldwide investigation. The olive oil routes that had once been invisible now lit up on maps. Palermo gives Naples, gives New York Marseille, gives Montreal, gives Ohio Genoa, gives Newark, gives Pennsylvania. Trapani gives Boston, gives Chicago. Wherever there was olive oil, there were records. Wherever there were records, there were pizza shops. And wherever there were pizza shops, there was heroin. For 4 years, investigators collected everything. Bank transfers, coded phone calls, shipping manifests, secret ledgers, informant statements, undercover surveillance. The same olive oil network, built in the 1930s, polished in the 1950s, expanded in the 1960s, was now being used as a roadmap for prosecutors. The mob's greatest strength, its logistics, had become its weakness. While law enforcement tightened the net, the Mafia was tearing itself apart. The men who had built the olive oil racket were losing power to younger, more ruthless Sicilian clans brought in to oversee the heroin trade. The old guard wanted predictability. The new guard wanted volume. Fast, huge, reckless. A quiet civil war began. The old olive oil bosses versus the new heroin bosses. In Sicily, the Corleonesi clan wiped out rivals in a campaign of mass murder. In New York, the Gambino, Bonanno, and Colombo families splintered under the pressure of heroin profits that dwarfed traditional rackets. Olive oil, once the lifeline between Sicily and America, turned into background noise, just another tool, no longer the prize. By the early 1980s, the Mafia didn't truly control the olive oil pipeline anymore. The heroin traffickers did. The final collapse arrived in the mid-1980s in the form of two historic court battles. 1. The Pizza Connection Trial, 1985-1987, the longest criminal trial in U.S. history, 22 months in court. 8 tons of evidence, 475 witnesses, 17 defendants, 14 convictions. In the courtroom, prosecutors displayed bottles of olive oil seized from mob-controlled warehouses, each containing hidden packets of heroin. The symbolism was undeniable. The olive oil empire was finished. The largest mafia prosecution Italy had ever dared to attempt. Buscetta testified again, repeating the same core truth. The olive oil roots became heroin roots, and heroin destroyed everything. The verdicts shredded the mafia's structure. Bosses locked away for life, smuggling routes exposed. Suppliers murdered in vendettas, corrupt port officials removed bank accounts, seized shipping companies forced into legitimacy. By the early 1990s, the olive oil racket, the infrastructure that once defined the mob's global power, was gone. The Mafia would never again control a major import industry with the same reach or precision. And yet, the legacy didn't completely disappear. If you know what to look for, you can still see pieces of it. Some olive oil brands in Europe still have colorful ownership, not illegal, not overtly criminal, just connected to families with interesting histories. Certain import businesses in New Jersey and Brooklyn survived. Today they're legal, family-run logistics firms, but their origins trace back to the old networks. Small Italian groceries in New York still buy from long-standing suppliers. Perfectly legitimate now, but their supply lines were once part of the racket. In southern Italy, some clans still run olive oil fraud, not heroin, just fake oil, water-dyed green, cheap vegetable oil sold as extra virgin, low-grade Greek oil rebottled as Sicilian gold. A multi-billion-dollar scam built on the skeleton of the old empire. The olive oil monopoly was never really about the product itself. It was about control, respectability, cover, infrastructure, identity, a living link to the old country. Those bottles carried more than oil. They carried tradition. They carried power. They carried bloodlines. When the Mafia lost olive oil, it didn't just lose a hustle. It lost its clean front, its grip on the supply chain, its invisible roots, its air of legitimacy, its seamless bridge to Sicily heroin brought in more money. But it carried a cost the mob didn't understand until it was too late. Olive oil made them powerful. Heroin made them exposed. Olive oil united the families. Heroin tore them apart. So today, when you walk into a New York supermarket and pick up a bottle of imported Italian olive oil, you're holding a relic of a vanished world, a world that once controlled ports, unions, judges, and politicians. A world that collapsed under the weight of its own greed and ambition. A world built on oil. That died on powder.